Yeah, so my working title for this project right now is Jesus versus the Patriarchy, focusing on feminism, Christians, and Christ, and the way that those things can really come together rather than be as divisive as they have been historically. So I'm going to take us through my preliminary work, which is kind of just going through some patriarchal history, pulling out some feminism themes throughout time, and then starting to talk about some of the implications that that has for us in the present and ways that we can begin to sort of bridge that gap. So in order to begin this, we need to talk about what patriarchy is. Many people think that it's just a synonym for saying men or a man. But when we're talking about patriarchy, we're talking about society and social systems and the ways that they function. And we are not talking about individuals. So societies that privilege men and that are oriented towards the needs of men and meeting only the needs of men are patriarchal, and the degree to which they are that way decides how patriarchal that society is. So a helpful metaphor, this is from Alan Johnson's The Gender Knot. He uses this tree metaphor to explain patriarchy, wherein at the roots of this tree you have these key ideologies like control, domination, and privilege that are all oriented towards men. And then at the trunk you have these larger reaching institutions like religion as a whole, government, and education, perhaps, as well. And at the branches, you have smaller, more intimately reaching institutions like the family or sports teams or a specific congregation of a church or other religious institution. And then finally, after the branches, you have the leaves. Now, individuals are the leaves. So you and I are leaves, and leaves are, one part of this huge system in which both men and women are participating. And so it is a focus on both men and women in patriarchal systems and societies, although we recognize that men are the ones that ultimately have the advantage. So didn't realize I would be having some extra time to speak, so I jumped ahead to the first few centuries in the Common Era. We find ourselves in an advanced agrarian society, which Love is credited for saying these kinds of societies have sort of a really rigid hierarchy with really strict divisions between men and women. And in Jewish culture at the time, men and women were divided so strictly, and women actually had very rigid rules about the ways in which they could interact in public with other people and as well as in private in order to maintain the honor that was such a big part of their society. Some prominent thinkers during this time, obviously the Apostle Paul, credited for many of the letters in the New Testament, because Jewish tradition was sort of unclear on whether or not women were made in God's image. This is kind of a big issue in that time. Were women and men equally made in the image of God? Was it just men? Was it just women? And Jewish tradition came back unclear on that topic. You see kind of a contrast between verses like 1 Corinthians 11:3, which sort of sets up this really rigid hierarchy, again, from God, man, wife, and that contrasts starkly with Galatians 3:28, which talks about there is no male nor female, and kind of this more egalitarian understanding of gender and gender relations. At the same time, you've got people like Aristotle, obviously a very big influence in the culture of that time and still is around today in our thought and study, saying things like women lack the autonomous capacity to reason, and they need kind of the help of the super elite, prominent Greek men in order to help them continuing this process with rational thought. And this kind of thinking actually affected interpretations of Genesis 1:27, talking about who was made in the image of God. And early Christians sort of linked that to conversations about divine wisdom and divine logos that you can find in John chapter 1. And understanding that, okay, divine logos is male. And we'll see a little bit later how other thinkers kind of pulled that theme through. In later Christianity, towards the Reformation era, you've got an absence of Christian mothers. Now, we've got, obviously church fathers, but we don't have church mothers. And that's not because women simply did not engage in religious thought at this time. It was just because history kind of overlooked them. And women were actually joining the monastery in, sizable numbers, but they just weren't given as much credit for their thought as were men. And sort of towards the Reformation era, family ideals of men as the head of household became super prominent, and women needed to be subservient to their husbands in that regard. And women were also excluded from politics. And this is the case because they were perceived to be ill fit for such a sphere, in which would require a lot of critical thinking and aggressive thought. And so you've got St. Augustine. Women, he's declaring that women are not made in the image of God and need to be subject to men. You've also got divine wisdom is male, which is a shift, because before that we recognized Proverbs 8 talking about divine wisdom, Sophia, as female, and contrasting that with 1 John talking about it as male, as the word becomes flesh, and flesh is Christ. And this is the shift to solely patriarchal language. We're going to solely focus on divine wisdom as male. And Calvin and Luther, we'll see, get on board with this idea as well. And then we've got Aquinas, who says, women are inherently inferior in mind and body. Women are the culmination of an incomplete gestation. So if women had just stayed in the womb a little bit longer, things would have turned out a lot better for them. And Jesus is male because maleness is completion, is the culmination of all the things, and therefore that's the only possible solution for Jesus to have been male. And then we move into the Victorian era and the antebellum period, and women are reconceptualized or conceptualized more succinctly as being these asexual, innocent, perpetually pure beings that need to be kept in the home because they're ill-suited for the harsh realities of the public sphere. And the home actually becomes this sort of fantasy heaven land where everything is as it should be, all is right with the world, and men who come home maybe a little bit bruised from their hard day at work need to be catered to, and their egos are then catered to by their wives, who are also rearing their offspring. And this is actually around the same time you see the first wave of feminism coming out. It came out of the abolition movement. People like the Grimke sisters were really prominent in this time as promoting not only the abolition of slavery, but then bleeding that over into conversations about women's suffrage and women gaining other social rights. And so that transition is starting to come at the same time as we have people, pushing back against that and saying, no, like, you need to stay in the home, you need to remain, maintain your purity, don't act out in anger or rage because that's ill-fitting for a woman. Do not express feelings of discontent, essentially. And then we move into the World War era. And again, for the sake of time, there's so much we can say about this period. It was a very progressive movement for the feminists, but I'm going to focus right now on the 1920s because this is where you start to see kind of a rift between some of the major rifts between church and like social norms as a whole. So you've got women who want to bring back the Victorian era, promoting this idea of, no, we're going to maintain faith and uphold these high standards of modesty and moral purity. At the same time, contrasting that with women who are really fighting for sexual liberation. They reject Christianity because they see it as being too patriarchal and too oppressive and hostile towards women for them to want anything to do with it any longer. They want birth control, which is illegal at this time and will remain illegal for decades to come. And this is also the time where you see the word feminism coming into play in America. This is the first time that women are self-identifying as feminists and moving forward with their causes. And so we see that this kind of begins to take shape as what we conceive to be feminism, this radical push against the traditions of the past. And this continues, and we transition into some of the 1950s to the 1970s, where you've got the suburbs developing. So you have people moving farther away from cities, and the development of that system in contrast with the public sphere. The distance becomes greater, and women are more removed from that arena, and their own culture kind of develops in the suburbs on how life works and how women's roles are to be. It's easier for them to stay in the home and, maybe leave to go shopping or do different sorts of things that are perceived to be acceptable for women to do. But at the same time, women are making 63% of a man's pay as they are joining the workforce more and more. And that receives a lot of backlash as women start to join the workforce, because after World War II, you've got the Cold War, where everyone is against communism and everyone is looking for ways to remain safe against communism. That's a really big threat of this time. And families were kind of conceptualized to be a prevention of communism. They are a smaller institution able to promote American core values that would promote democracy and freedom. And so when women, particularly feminists, would start to kind of push against the traditional family that has been constructed, you see a lot of backlash for that. And women ran the risks of being accused of communism and being a communist, which at that time was a very severe accusation. But you also see towards the end of this era, this kind of time frame that I've selected, some denominations are ordaining women and starting to use inclusive language in Bibles and hymnals. So they're referring to, sons and daughters, children of God, rather than, one or the other. And often it was just the sons. And this is also the time when you have the second wave of feminism, really focused on women's liberation, things like the Equal Rights Amendment and Roe versus Wade, and other sort of political movements that started up during this time. It's also more of a diverse movement. In the past, it had been focused solely on, the middle and upper class white women, who were the ones that were most mobile to be able to speak against these issues. But you see it incorporating different races and classes, and it's sort of this more inclusive movement where different things like Christian feminism or African American feminism aren't necessarily seen as divisive, but is providing opportunities to reach more people and to bring more people into this movement. Because a big part of the feminist movement is that it is for everyone, not just women or not just white women. And it was inspired by the civil rights movement. Just kind of that hope that a small group of people could grow and band together and sort of create huge, long-lasting social change was really inspirational and gave them a lot of their momentum to organize and continue on this path. And then in the 80s and 90s, you'll sort of see this group really becoming prominent. This is the Christian right. They are a small group of highly conservative fundamentalist Christians who are attempting to pose opposition to the feminist movement. When you refer to the Christian right, you're referring to groups who have politicized their movements. So they're not just your average conservative Christians speaking in congregations or stuff like that, but who have taken their movement, organized, and have gone public with it. They see family as kind of the core unit of American society, and the perception of the American family is one that has, a married couple with kids doing their thing, and men as the head of household and as the breadwinner, and that's sort of the way that they have grown up conceptualizing those things and continue to see those things as being able to, affirm the Christian way of doing family, and they will draw deeply on biblical truth in order to put forth that argument. And their big mission is to overturn things like Roe versus Wade and oppose the ERA as it continues to move forward because of the ways that those things pose a threat to this traditional idea of family. And so that is we've kind of hit present for the most part. And what we've seen, up to this point is this huge tension between feminism and Christianity in the church. And we kind of have perceived feminism to be this very loud, anti-man sort of agenda, and then the church as being, posing this very traditional, root of everything, and it creates this kind of continuum where you've got the church over here and feminists over here, and never the two shall meet. There's no way there's just too big of a gap. The ideologies are too different. Their missions are too different. There's no like clear way to kind of bridge that gap. However, what my work will continue to do is to show that there is a way to fill that gap through Christian feminism. Christian feminism calls upon kind of the ideals, the core ideals of both arguments, and shows that they can create a synthesis somewhere in the middle. So Christians in the church who come to understand or come to think that men and women need to be perceived equally in the church, and that some of the ways that church history has oppressed and hurt women no longer has to be a reason for them to leave the church, but they can find a home in the church still. And the same way, feminists who have for a long time thought that religion is just too far out there for them to even consider can now kind of come to the table and have a conversation. And Christian feminism kind of calls upon some of these core ideals as a synthesis, whereas Jesus is the lens through which we view Scripture and through which we view the world, and that we affirm Jesus as being this sort of this feminist in and of himself in a lot of ways, this very radical social mover, as well as affirming egalitarianism over complementarianism in order to affirm the equality that the image of God gives each of us, as well as affirming the ordination of women and continuing to perpetuate that throughout the existing denominations that still feel like that is an issue for them at the core. So yes, as my research continues, it will continue to analyze current trends and pull out feminist ideas and pull out church ideas and show how they can come to the table together. Thank you. Those are my references, in case you're wondering.
Well, we have a few minutes for questions for Abby. Any questions in the room?
Yes, please.
And you may not know the answer just from the history books or as you're laying out the timeline of these different changes, and particularly focused on the sort of post-1970 Victorian era and pushback against family transformation. You talked about the man, the kind of idealized man as the head of household. Is no literature that the idea of the man as the spiritual head of the household emerging at the same time, or if that's an older trend that just picked up and used?
Gotcha.
My hypothesis is that becomes a really useful way to talk about it in contemporary terms, seen in the context of about that time period as a kind of corrective move against larger children. I don't know if you run into any.
Yeah, that would be interesting to look into more for sure. I know that what I have found so far kind of indicates that the term spiritual head of the household wasn't necessary to have come about until more recently, because now we're starting to look at, okay, well, women they have jobs, like they function inside the home as well as outside the home. And so now it's like, okay, well, men are the spiritual head of the household. There's sort of that, perhaps, I don't want to say like saving grace of this idea, but certainly as a way to continue to perpetuate that idea. But I'll have to look into that more specifically. And thank you, that's really helpful. Anything else?
Other questions? Thank you, Abby.
Thank you.